I chose Ethan because he was the stillest soul I had ever felt. Among my people, the velhari, we do not fall in love the way other species describe it. We do not speak of hearts racing or breath catching. We feel. We reach outward with the quiet part of ourselves, and we sense the emotional current of those around us, the way a hand trailing in water feels the temperature, the pull, the depth. Most beings I had encountered in my years as a diplomat burned too bright or churned too dark. Warriors radiated aggression like heat from an engine. Politicians flickered with calculation and hunger. Even kind souls often carried something restless underneath, a current of want that never quite settled. Ethan was different. The first time I stood near him at a Concord research symposium, I reached out gently with my senses, the way I always did, cautiously, politely, the way you might glance at someone without staring. What I found stopped me completely. He was calm. Not the empty calm of someone who felt nothing, but the deep, settled calm of still water over great depth. Warm and quiet and profoundly at peace. I had never felt anything like it in another living being. I introduced myself. He looked up from his research display, blinked once and said, "You have the most incredible bioluminescence I have ever seen. Do you mind if I ask whether it changes with your mood, or is it more of a structural thing?" I told him it changed with my mood. He smiled and said, "Then I hope I'm saying the right things, because you just got brighter." I married him 14 months later. Life aboard Concord Station Vel 9 suited us both. The station hung near the galactic core like a lantern in deep water, home to diplomats and researchers and traders from dozens of species. Ethan worked in the lower biology labs, cataloging alien organisms and writing papers that he claimed nobody read, but that somehow kept winning awards. I worked in the diplomatic wing, facilitating conversations between species who struggled to understand each other. In the evenings, we cooked together, badly, a blend of his recipes and mine that never quite worked, but always tasted interesting. He learned 3 words of velhari. I learned to appreciate his terrible jokes. Every night before sleep, I placed my hand on his chest and felt his heartbeat. Steady, measured, unhurried. That rhythm became something I depended on without realizing it. It was the sound of safety. I should tell you about the krethak, so you understand what happened. They are an old species, large, armored reptilian, with a civilization built entirely around the idea that strength is the only truth that matters. They had been conquering and absorbing smaller species for thousands of years, before the galactic Concord was even formed. When humanity joined the Concord, the krethak were openly dismissive. Humans were small, soft, new. They had no armored skin, no natural weapons, no history of galactic warfare. The krethak looked at humanity and saw something barely worth noticing. Most of the galaxy quietly agreed with them, though few said so out loud. I never thought much about it. Ethan was a researcher, a gentle man who got emotional watching alien sunsets, and who once spent 40 minutes trying to coax a frightened station cat out from under a console because he did not want it to be scared. The question of whether humanity was formidable had nothing to do with my life. Then Warlord Grathulun arrived. His warship came without announcement, which was itself a declaration. It was enormous, dark, and bristling with weapons that the station's defense systems quietly flagged as more powerful than our own. Grathulun wanted access to a velhari data archive stored on Vel 9, containing star maps to uncharted resource worlds. The Concord leadership refused, so he did what krethak do when refused. He took hostages. 15 of us from the diplomatic wing were moved to a secured bay near the docking corridor. 2 krethak soldiers stood at the door. Grathulun himself delivered the terms over the station-wide channel, his voice carrying the particular boredom of someone who had done this before and found it tedious. He gave the Concord 6 hours. I sat on the floor of that bay with my back against the wall, and I did what I always do when I am frightened. I reached outward. I found the emotional signatures of the people around me. Fear, mostly. Some anger. One of the Dolvari diplomats radiated a cold, resigned fury that felt like iron. And then, carefully, I reached further. I searched for the particular warmth I knew better than any other. I found Ethan in the lower labs, 2 levels below and half a station away. What I felt made me go very still. He already knew. The station-wide channel had reached him too. And what I felt from my husband in that moment was not the panic I expected, not the frantic, helpless fear of someone who loves a person in danger and cannot reach them. I had braced for that. I knew how to be soothed by him even through distance. What I felt instead had no name in my language. It was stillness, but not his usual stillness. His usual stillness was like a quiet room, warm and familiar. This was different. This was the stillness of something that had made a decision and was no longer debating. The stillness of water that has found its direction and is simply moving now, without hurry, without doubt. There was no heat in it, no wild emotion, just a vast, quiet, absolute certainty pointing in one direction, toward me. I felt him begin to move. I do not know everything that happened in the next hour. I know what I felt, and I know what was later shown on the station feeds, that the Concord Broadcast Council, in a decision that would be argued about for years afterward, chose not to cut. Every ambassador on every Concord-connected station and ship saw what I only felt from a distance. The first krethak soldier was stationed at a maintenance junction on level 4. He was trained, armored, and armed. He went silent without raising an alarm. Ethan had published a paper 18 months earlier on krethak neural architecture, specifically the cluster of pressure-sensitive nodes beneath the secondary jaw plating. He had written about it with pure academic interest, the way he wrote about everything, curious and careful, and completely without malice. He used that knowledge now. The second soldier at the corridor checkpoint lasted slightly longer, long enough to reach for his communicator. He did not complete the motion. I felt Ethan moving through the station like a current beneath the surface. That deep cold had not changed. It did not spike with excitement or darken with cruelty. It simply continued, purposeful and patient, and I realized with a strange clarity that this was not something that had appeared tonight. This was something that had always been there, underneath the warm and laughing man who burned dinner and cried at sunsets. I had felt the surface of him for 3 years and thought I knew the depth. I had not known the depth. The krethak inside the hostage bay heard that their patrols had stopped reporting in. I felt their agitation spike sharply. Grathulun's voice came over a short-range channel, demanding answers. No answers came. He sent more soldiers toward the last reported positions. I reached for Ethan again. He had paused. I felt him breathe. A slow and deliberate breath, the kind I had watched him take before particularly difficult conversations or complex dissections. And then something happened that I still struggle to describe. The emotional signature I had always known. The warm, steady, readable Ethan, who felt like home, stepped back. Not disappeared. Stepped back, and what remained in front was something quieter and older, and so completely focused that it barely registered to my senses at all. The way a very dark thing in a very dark room is harder to see than something that gives off light. He was still in there. He had simply chosen to set himself aside for a moment. The door to our bay opened from the outside, not forced, not broken. The access code was entered correctly. Ethan had found it in the maintenance logs he had access to as a senior researcher, logs he had read once during an orientation tour, and apparently never forgotten. He stood in the doorway. He was wearing his lab clothes. He had a bruise forming along his left jaw, and his knuckles were cut. He looked at the room full of frightened diplomats, and then his eyes found me, and something in his face shifted, a tightening around the eyes, a compression of the mouth, and through the bond I felt the briefest flicker of something raw and fiercely relieved before he pushed it back down. "Stay low," he said to the room, quietly. "Stay together. I need 2 more minutes." And then he was gone again. Grathulun met him in the main corridor outside the docking bay. This was on the station feed. The warlord was in full armor, standing at his full height of nearly 3 meters, surrounded by his remaining soldiers, and when Ethan walked around the corner, the krethak actually paused for a moment out of sheer surprise, before beginning to laugh. It was a deep, rumbling, genuinely amused sound. "A human," he said. "They sent a human." Ethan stopped walking. He stood very straight. He looked up at Grathulun the way I had seen him look at data that did not add up, with patience and a complete absence of intimidation, and he said, in a voice so level it sounded almost gentle, "You have my wife." The Concord feed stayed live. Every species watched. I cannot describe what followed in the language of action, because I did not see it. I felt it. Through the bond, through 2 walls and a corridor, I felt my husband for every second of it. And what I felt was the strangest and most profound thing I have ever experienced in my life as an empath. He was not angry. Anger is something I know well. It is hot and sharp and bright, and it burns quickly, and underneath it, there is almost always fear or hurt or grief doing the actual work. Anger is a flame. What I felt from Ethan was nothing like a flame. It was pressure. It was the particular, enormous, patient pressure of something that had been compressed for a very long time and had now been given a direction. It was grief and love and 3 years of quiet mornings and bad cooking and steady heartbeats, all converted into something singular and utterly without waste. There was no rage in it. There was no performance in it. There was only the complete, efficient expenditure of everything he was toward one purpose: getting back to me. Later, when I watched the footage, I understood why the other species went so quiet. It was not that Ethan was superhuman. He was not. He was hurt by the end of it. One arm held close to his side, breathing hard, the bruises already darkening. The krethak soldiers were larger and stronger. Grathulun himself was ancient and experienced, and genuinely dangerous. What unsettled every watching diplomat and general and ambassador was not what Ethan could do. It was that he never, not once, considered stopping. There was no point at which the math of the situation caused him to hesitate, no calculation of odds, no moment of self-preservation that flickered across his face. The krethak understand strength. They respect power. What they had no framework for was someone who simply had no stop point. Not because he was reckless or wild or out of control, but because the thing he was moving toward mattered more than the thing he might lose. Grathulun was not defeated quickly, but he was defeated completely. When it was over, Ethan stood still for a moment in the corridor. I felt him take that same slow breath, and then the wall came down, and all at once, I felt everything he had pressed down and set aside come flooding back through him. The fear, the adrenaline, the shaking aftermath of something the body does not forget, even when the mind directs it. He caught himself against the wall with one hand, and then he straightened up and walked back to the bay. He crossed the room and he held me, and his arms were shaking, and I pressed my hand against his chest and found his heartbeat, and it was fast now, and unsteady, nothing like the calm rhythm I knew. He pressed his face against the top of my head and I felt him breathe. "Are you okay?" he whispered. I could not answer immediately. I was standing inside the wreckage of every assumption I had made about the man I married, and I was finding, to my amazement, that the rubble was more beautiful than what had stood there before. In the days that followed, the Concord issued formal statements. The krethak Dominion withdrew its warship and, without announcement, quietly reduced its territorial pressure on several human colony systems. The warlord made no public comment. 3 separate species requested updated xenobiological profiles of humanity. A Dulvari admiral was quoted in the diplomatic record as saying that her people had always assumed humans were harmless because they smiled, and that it had not occurred to her that smiling might be a choice. Ethan came home with a splinted arm and a prescription for pain relief, and the same expression he always wore, easy and open and slightly amused by the universe. He made tea. He burned it slightly. He made a joke about it. I watched him move around our small kitchen in the station's evening light, and I thought about stillness, about depth, about all the things I had sensed in him from the very beginning, and understood only now that the calm I had fallen in love with was not the absence of something powerful. It was something powerful, fully aware of itself, choosing every single day to be gentle, choosing warmth, choosing patience, choosing me. I placed my hand on his chest. His heartbeat had found its way back to steady. I closed my eyes, and I finally understood the full truth of what I had married. Not a quiet man, but a storm that had learned to love the calm so much it wore it every day like a choice, like a gift, like the most profound act of will I had ever felt in another living soul. And somewhere across the galaxy, species that had never taken humanity seriously were sitting with that footage and feeling, for the first time, something that had a very clear name. They were reconsidering,